I see people are trickling in. Welcome, everybody. We'll get started here in a few minutes. Happy Earth Day to everyone as well. Very fitting for us to have this conversation on today. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So if you want to pop it into the chat, that'd be great. We've got our panelists from all over. So it's always fun to see where everyone is tuning in from. All right, let us go ahead and get started. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. We have an incredible lineup of speakers for this roundtable on top climate innovation trends. Again, my name is Taylor Ann Adams, and I am a managing director at the Cannon. For those who don't know, the Cannon is a startup development organization that aims to connect entrepreneurs with all of the resources they need to succeed. And that ranges from programs like this one to advisors, to investors, and even community support. We are super thrilled to be partnering with Global Affairs Associates on this event. And for those of you that don't know, Global Affairs Associates is a women-owned environmental, social, and governance consulting firm, also known as ESG, which I'm sure y'all are familiar with. And they help clients make strategic and business appropriate decisions regarding sustainability. Global Affairs Associates helps its clients better understand and connect with investors and customers on ESG issues, and they bring deep expertise in energy and investment sectors to the entrepreneurial community. They've been a huge asset to the Cannon, and we are very grateful for their partnership and insights that they constantly provide. So obviously, climate innovation is a huge, huge topic in today's time, and the Global Affairs Associates team is extremely well suited to advise investors and customers on all these issues. So like I said, we have an incredible panel of experts joining us. So I'm going to go run through their bios so that you can get to know them, and then make sure to connect with them on LinkedIn and ask any kind of questions in the Q&A. So we're going to start off with Jennifer Cooper. Jennifer has 20 years of experience in the field of product policy and sustainable product design. She serves as a trusted advisor to Fortune 500 companies, helping firms leverage influential market expectations to improve business and expand market share. Jennifer's expertise spans the consumer product, electronics, automotive, heavy equipment, pharmaceutical, and mining sectors. And she has worked with a variety of firms ranging from Volvo to Coca-Cola to Johnson & Johnson and even Xerox. She is the Vice President of Client Strategy at Native, a public benefit corporation that works with companies to take meaningful, lasting climate action in and with communities their businesses rely upon. Thanks, Jennifer, for being here with us today. Next, we have Jamila Yamani. She serves as the Senior Principal at Climate Impact Capital, performing technology identification diligence, and innovation strategy within the energy, energy efficiency, and water energy nexus sectors. Jamila's deep science background, alongside her previous private equity work as a science advisor at Pegasus Capital Advisors, integrates technical and business skills focused on sustainability across various verticals, including waste, agriculture, water, and the built environment. She received her PhD in chemical and environmental engineering from Yale University and serves on the advisory board of Global Affairs Associates. And finally, we are joined today by Global Affairs Associates' own senior consultant, Erica Lasdon. Erica has 20 plus years of experience from the investment and nonprofit sectors. She specializes in ESG integration, materiality analysis, investment trends, and engagement strategy. She played a central role in ESG investment functions at Calvert, which is a responsible investment pioneer, with deep expertise in ESG issue analysis and multi-stakeholder engagement. As Director of Sustainability and Research, she directed development of the in-house ESG rating system used in 2015 to launch a new investment product and revamp the existing product suite. So now that you have met our incredibly impressive panelists, I'm a little intimidated, not gonna lie, we can dive right into questions. And please keep in mind that we will have a Q&A session towards the end of the event, and we would love as much participation as possible. So during the event, feel free to ask questions within the Q&A, and then we'll save the last 15 minutes at the end of the event to kind of review all of those so that y'all can get your questions answered. All right, so I'm gonna kick us off with our first question. So what are the top climate innovation trends you are seeing in your sector, and what is the work your organization is currently doing? And Erica, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Thanks, Taylor Ann, and thanks to everybody who is joining today. I'm excited to have this conversation. I'm going to start by talking a little bit from a broader investor perspective. So in the work that I'm doing now, I'm sometimes working with companies in sectors who are looking to develop their ESG strategy and communicate, understand investor needs, and working increasingly with investors in who are investors in the publicly traded equity space, but in the private capital space. So think private equity funds, LPs, investors in the venture space. And that's something that is relatively new. So that's the first trend that I would talk about as sort of a broad macro trend. Over the last 10 years, there has been a strong uptake outside of investors who focus just on maybe buying stock in large companies. That's where a lot of it started, looking to influence disclosure in top companies whose names you all heard of, who drive the stock indexes. But it, increasingly moved not only to integrate more deeply within that investment space, but to be in all of the aspects of finance. So in bond issuance, in private capital where the disclosure isn't so broad, but the pressure through initiatives like the UN's Principles for Responsible Investment really drove a lot of uptake. And we're starting to see some of those really drive acceleration, I think, in climate innovation across a lot of sectors. And sort of those financing trends and the spread of climate accounting and ESG in general across asset classes and across different types of financial products. I mean, now you can't go a day if you're following climate news without seeing central banks and, not just your typical ESG investing names really focus on this and bring it into all aspects of finance. And that's also driving, I think, another trend, which is, I think of it as intersectionality within environmental issues. So climate innovation, I think, is also going hand in hand with looking at what used to be siloed as biodiversity issues. So you're finding a lot of nature-based solutions, and you're also finding a lot of intersections with consumer use. And I'm sure, Jamila and Jennifer have this intersects with all of our work quite a lot. And that's good because we're learning to walk and chew gum at the same time and not only think about mitigating your direct greenhouse gas emissions. And then beyond that, I would say sort of related, some of the shorter term trends that I've seen is the race to net zero pledges that we've been seeing coming down the pike, not just, of course, on the national stage, since the here in the US, there's the climate innovation, or I'm sorry, the climate White House summit, which leads the news headlines today because, as expected, President Biden has announced a new target, but corporate targets, everybody is revising their net zero targets to be more aggressive. And that's also, I think, pushing down to climate innovation, and that in order to make those targets, you can't get there by buying offsets. You can't get there just by doing any one thing. You really have to invest in innovation. And the big way that I'd say that's changing things is it's putting corporate pressure on finding solutions across their operations, including their supply chains. But it's also leading to some climate financing for innovation that's coming from the corporate side. Corporate financing has really increased quite a lot. So we're seeing it across all sectors too. I'm sure we'll have a lot of time to talk about some of these other trends, but those are some of the big trends that I've seen in my work from the sort of 500-foot level of the investor.
Yeah, it's incredible. And you're exactly right. You're seeing it in the news constantly. It's the topic of every conversation. So I think the timing is impeccable so that we're having this roundtable and able to kind of suss all this out. Jamila, what about you? I'd love to kind of hear from your perspective, the top innovation trends and kind of what the work that CIC is doing.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Taylor. So I think, a good segue into the work that CIC does is we work on these decarbonization strategies, climate change readiness strategies with corporate partners in oil and gas and power utilities to achieve those net zero targets that Erica mentioned. We see it kind of across the board. Really, some companies have, quite aggressive targets that will include scope 1, 2, and scope 3 emissions without maybe a roadmap of how to get there. And that's, where CIC comes in. And like Erica mentioned, innovation is kind of the platform that we use to do that, venture capital kind of being the tool that we use. And I think some of the major trends I'm looking through here, since we work in oil and gas and power utilities, mainly on the energy sector, is of course upstream and downstream emissions reductions. But I think more importantly, the trends that we're seeing is new utilization of traditional materials. That includes natural gas, that includes CO2, kind of across the board. What does that look like? And what does that look like scaled up? Because unless we can make those economies make sense from a dollar's perspective, we can't expect them to take off on a larger scale. Needs across the world vary dramatically. Asia's needs look very different from that of the United States. So I think it's a very regional perspective, depending on what resources are available. But innovation is happening everywhere, especially here in the States. We've seen a lot of interest these days in hydrogen. A lot of huge investment in this space, and I think it still remains to be seen what that's going to look like. We saw a hydrogen peak a couple of years ago, and I don't know if anything really materialized out of it. So I'm still, eager to see what all that capital brings to the table now. And I think the other, mentioning the intersectionality, the two other big pieces are around infrastructure. That includes from a power perspective, as well as utilizing old infrastructure, old assets, investment in whatever our new decarbonized future looks like. For example, leaning on natural gas infrastructure to support the hydrogen market. Of course, that kind of brings us into EVs and what does that discussion look like? How can we support that? And the last big trend, and I think we can kind of thank COVID a little bit for this, is the idea of resiliency. Of course, those of us in Texas recognize what happened to us, 2 months ago, but that conversation, I think, predated the winter storm back when we were in COVID. or well, I should say in the thick of COVID, because we're still kind of technically there. But what does a resilient infrastructure look like? Decentralization on a much broader scale, not just with respect to power, but I think all resources in general. And so, I think that will continue to be part of the conversation as we move ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Jennifer, would love to hear from you about innovation trends and all the stuff that y'all are doing to kind of work on that.
Thank you, Taylor Ann. Nice to be here with everybody. Our work at Native over the past few decades has been to work with companies to catalyze new action on climate, new action to reduce or remove CO2. So in that context, the trends that we see today include transitioning agricultural systems to operations that pull carbon from the atmosphere, halt ecosystem degradation, and restore soil health, waterways, and biodiversity. So in short, regenerative agriculture, although there's not an official definition and different people mean different things there. And I know, Jamila, that you have a background in agriculture, so it'd be great to chat with you about that at some point. Very specifically in the work we do, we see a trend of companies looking into their sourcing region. So in the context of regenerative agriculture, which is the one trend that I'll focus on for the moment here, companies looking into their sourcing regions, identifying practice changes, and growers, most importantly, growers ready to adopt those changes, then stepping up to enable that change to happen, working with growers and farmers. And the drivers for this particular trend that we're seeing include the corporate goals to protect biodiversity, protect waterways, restore soil health, goals to improve livelihoods in some of the supply regions. And that's really getting at the intersectionality point that, that Erica brought up. So, and of course, the other primary driver for this, from the context of the work that we do, is corporate goals to mitigate climate impacts. So some companies, as Erica mentioned, are augmenting the efforts that they have in place to avoid or reduce their direct emissions by also taking efforts to draw down emissions or to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and sequester it in many different ways, but in context of this trend, sequester that carbon in agricultural soils through regenerative and other practices. And whether that be part of a net zero climate goal or something that's alongside a science-based target climate commitment or another corporate climate ambition. And for regenerative agriculture to help advance particular climate goals, any of the carbon sequestered must be permanent and lasting. So the carbon need remain in the soils for decades and decades. So thus we see a trend not only to support a shift to regenerative agriculture in sourcing regions, but a trend to structure lasting partnerships and long-term arrangements that first catalyze that change to happen and then support that change to become business as usual in agriculture. For examples of this, we can look at sheep grazed in the Patagonia region of Argentina or cattle grazed in the United States, Northern Great Plains, grasslands, different parts of the world, and to really draw the carbon into the soils where livestock graze in these regions. We see growers increasing the number of animals grazed and reducing the size or the space on which or the plot where they're grazing. Then moving the animals from one plot to another and allowing long periods of rest for the grasses on those plots before the sheep or the cattle livestock graze them again. This is what's allowing those grasses to grow tall, the roots to go down deep and sequester that carbon in the soil. Of course, to do this, and we can get to this, when we're talking about barriers, there are some specialized fencing that farms may need to keep sheep or cattle in one area for a time and then move them to another plot for a time, as well as movable water troughs and piping. So in some cases, actually financing the cost of that equipment, bringing that capital is what will scale the number of farms that are able to make this type of transition and to this type of grazing pattern. Also, of course, essential to that is really understanding farm by farm which regenerative practices a given farm is interested and willing to adopt or expand, and knowing that plan for new practices is what enables enables you to model how much carbon will accrue in the soils. So that is one way that regenerative agricultural practices can result in carbon removals. And within this larger trend of companies looking to catalyze regenerative agriculture is a specific climate-driven trend to look for opportunities, not only to make that transition, but to also measure and verify the carbon removals that result and to ensure their permanence. Of course, carbon removals as a climate benefit come right alongside the multitude of other benefits for biodiversity, nutritional and productivity benefits that regenerative agriculture offers to our agricultural system. Again, that intersectionality that Erica was mentioning. Yeah, so that's a key trend that I wanted to share, and I'll pause there.
Fantastic. That's extremely interesting. So thank you for sharing all of that. We will move on to the next question, which is, what are the missing pieces currently existing in the ecosystem that need to be addressed to fully scale these climate innovations? Jamila, we can start with you.
Thanks, Taylor. So I think one of the big pieces is the idea of the circular economy, but not as I think we know it as a consumer that talks about consumer goods and that economy, but more on the petrochemicals and carbon dioxide side. How do we close the loop for petrochemical based materials and CO2, such that we can create materials and sequester that CO2 in a consumer good or in a product, perhaps not long-term, underground or, in that capacity. There are several technologies, for example, that can take CO2 or natural gas to a number of different end products, but they're not done at scale yet, and certainly not at a cost point that is feasible for large scale use that's going to make a difference for us yet. And I think that's probably the number one biggest piece of it. The second, of course, is carbon utilization. As I mentioned, there are CO2 as a building block technologies and chemistries already being investigated, but that's just starting to scratch the surface of what we can do with carbon dioxide. We kind of hear about direct air capture as kind of the number one, but when we've got this pure CO2 stream or close to pure, what can we do with it? There are solid materials that we can make catalysts, we can make a number of different things. And I think really understanding where the major opportunities are related to specific regions is going to push the innovation that makes sense for that location. And I think that's a really big part of the conversation because, for example, if we're talking about capturing CO2, you have to be able to utilize it in a place that makes sense for a product that you require. We can't be generating or capturing CO2 here in the States for a use in Asia because it just doesn't make logistical sense. So I think that's probably one of the big pieces that I think is still missing. But thankfully, we've got a ton of innovation in that space, and I've seen so many startups, and hopefully we'll continue to see more work going on in that sector.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Erica, what about you? Oh, you're muted.
Overzealous in trying to restrict the background noise. I forgot. There's a lot of missing pieces that one could talk about, but one that I really wanted to bring up and focus on a little bit is the need to sort of wring carbon emissions out of supply chains. And this gets a little bit at the sort of scope 3 emissions that everybody is, are hidden, are hard to uncover. And it's not that there's not a lot of need in other places in the generation, in the energy side, but especially when it comes to climate innovation, I think that there's a huge yawning gap of needs there. And it involves everything from some of the maybe the sexier innovation R&D discovery type of things. We certainly need R&D and exciting scientific innovations in a lot of areas, but we also just need measurement. We need tools. We need the capacity building to really tackle the type of sort of depth that we need for the global supply chain. So I'm seeing, to tie back to one of the trends that I talked about in the first question, in the push to sort of net zero from the large corporate side, pushing down the supply chain is something that's definitely continuing, but you know, there is, especially when you look at innovation, and there's a need for, I think, the widget makers, right? The service providers, you know, all of those pieces that we need it to come from a lot of different directions in order to build some of that capacity. You know, one reference point is there was a World Economic Forum report that talked about the global supply chains for 8 industries that they saw as being most necessary. And that it's good to, you know, sound them out to see sort of the breadth of the challenge that's there for the supply chain. Food, construction, fashion, consumer goods, particularly ones that transit quickly, electronics, automotive, professional services, and freight, right? Each one of those areas is going to have different places and different solutions, some of which are, you know, not going to seem like they're sort of a massive lightning striking moment at one, but all of those pieces add up to a whole lot. So that the World Economic Forum report estimated that more of half of global emissions came from those sectors in those global supply chains, and food alone was 1/4 of that total. So if there is a place to talk about agriculture, which I know the other panelists talk about, is a big one.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. And Jennifer, I'd love to hear from you about some missing pieces that kind of could help build this bridge.
Thanks. Well, thinking about the trend that I highlighted with the transition to regenerative, it's really linked to the trend that you were bringing up, Erica, of bringing emissions out of supply chains, and a real focus on, for a lot of large corporations, really focusing on where can they make change in supply chains. So specific to regenerative agriculture as a small part of the solution, among the different missing pieces to scale that is certainly the lack of meaningful support for farms and growers, especially smallholder farms, family operated businesses. It stands to reason that the smallholders should not bear the financial burden nor the risk to their businesses of transitioning to different practices, yet they should stand to reap the productivity, health, and overall business benefits that can result, including reduced costs for inputs such as forage and the grazing example that I gave, or improved nutrient density of grasses, improved animal health, more drought tolerant grasses, and other productivity gains. So I think that current lack of the support, and perhaps even a pushing down of targets to, or pushing out into the supply chain, here's what we expect of suppliers, without recognizing who is going to take on the financial, the capital costs and the risk. But I do think, you know, a lot of the organizations that we work are working to change that, where we work with are working to change that. And I do see signs of organizations, you know, getting ready, stepping up to fill in that gap in terms of information support, and also the just financing that transition specifically.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, such an important thing that I think oftentimes isn't considered when you're thinking about the larger picture is the impact of these individual farmers and the land that they have and the products they're producing. So thank you for that. And then a third question, I would love to know from each of you how you believe we can build equity into the climate action space. And whoever wants to jump in, I'll let you guys go ahead and jump in. Do you want to start us, Erica?
Absolutely. I unmuted this time before I started talking. You know, before I used the word intersectionality to refer to environmental connections, and I made that I use that word on purpose because I also think that intersectionality between what were previously siloed, I think, as social issues or social investing is really intersecting a lot. And I would say, I feel optimistic that some of those bridges that we're seeing being built now are, are going to be around to last for a while. That this is not going to be something where things just sort of drift apart again. And building equity, both equity in terms of income inequality, in terms of racial and gender equity, I think is we're seeing it as a priority that's coming in. I think I'm optimistic that that's going to continue, but it only is going to continue if people continue to work to answer those questions as they, as they build their solutions or as they work on their pieces to broaden a network, to make sure that your stakeholders, your leadership, your outreach efforts all have an equity lens that you're looking to do that. I think that I'm always a big believer at a high level that if you pay attention to representation, particularly in terms of leadership, and you bring transparency to things, that plays an important supporting role. It's not everything. I think we started to see that a little bit. I know we're here talking about climate innovation, but there was large corporate action on voting rights. We saw that a lot in the news recently. And part of the reason that happened was because there was a core still underrepresented of African-American executives, leading CEOs. And that action, the corporate action wouldn't have happened without their leadership in doing that. And that's just one little example of how representation is important. So it's important to whatever you're doing, whether it's testing a product, whether it's creating a board, recruiting, all of those other pieces to make sure that you bring the breadth of racial and gender equality and think broadly about the demographics involved.
Yeah, that is extremely important. And I think a constant thing that needs to be echoed across organizations and leadership teams to continue to keep that top of mind, because that's where the real change is going to happen when we have different viewpoints and different perspectives. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. Jamila or Jennifer, do either of y'all want to jump in about building equity in the climate action space?
Sure. So another kind of space that I think is important for us to consider here is in that discussion about resiliency. We often know that those underrepresented communities are the first to be impacted and usually the last to receive such funding to improve. And recognizing that in a lot of the infrastructure improvements that we will expect and the innovation that's going into it, those are the communities that we need to address as a primary. As a priority. And I think now, as you mentioned, we are becoming more aware of that, but until recently, I don't think that was top of mind. An interesting anecdote came when we were talking to a corporate power executive who mentioned that when folks start putting on solar on their homes and start selling back to the grid, who offsets the cost of that for the utility? And it's the lower income housing that has to pay higher power prices to offset that, residential solar, for example, that are on more affluent homes. It was a really different perspective than I think that I had been familiar with, because we rarely see, obviously, residential solar in low income neighborhoods. That's a mismatch. And that's unfortunate, because those communities need resilient infrastructure as much as any other community. So I think, recognizing the need transcends income is is very critical. And of course, we know that income is very much tied to racial equity. And I think that's an important consideration as we move this resiliency discussion along.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Jennifer, would love to hear from you.
Sure. And I think I would just add to that, agreeing very much with all of what was said. And while it's important, I think, to be asking, which voices are at the table in these conversations and which voices are not, I think we also need to be asking, who has defined the problem we think we are solving? And who do we think we are solving for? So those involved in climate action and trying to fix the things that are broken. And I think that there's really harder work to do there to have voices and perspectives meaningfully define the climate action and the change that occurs. There's stakeholder outreach and engagement processes and these types of things at each turn. And I just think it transcends just doing a good job to really include lots of voices in that, but really rather recognizing the shortcomings of those types of approaches and how far into decision processes that type of engagement happens. And just really going back to what was initially said about, who's in the leadership and really shaping the action that we're taking from the get-go. I think it's important.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. We definitely have some questions coming in from the audience, but I just want to recognize you all for being here today and for all of the work that you guys are doing with climate change and innovation. Really grateful for that and for the female leadership that y'all are offering. It's really inspiring, and I love to be moderating a panel filled with incredible women. It's a treat for me. So thank you all. So let's go with our first question. The question says, I am with an energy innovation hub. We are looking at starting an ESG program, but do not want to duplicate existing services already in the marketplace. What might be your advice about gaps in the market or corporate needs that are not yet being met? And that's from Jill Vassar with Epicenter. Anyone feel free to jump in on that one.
Like that's definitely for Erica.
Let me know if you want me to read it again.
I want to could you read it one more time? I want to be sure to make sure I'm on point.
Absolutely, yes. So she's with an energy innovation hub, and they're looking at starting an ESG program, but they don't want to duplicate existing services that already exist in the marketplace. So what might be your advice about gaps in the market or corporate needs that are not yet being met?
An energy innovation hub.
Yes.
So I think that's part of the reason why I was hesitating is, I was trying to wrap my head around interpreting what that would mean and where the gaps would be. I will say that there's room for it not to be too concerned about duplicating other services that are offered because there's such a large need for it. In fact, maybe one of the things to do is to look at what some of the successful, slightly more mature services are and get some ideas there. It's a large and growing market. So if there are other service providers out there, there's probably lots more people needing that service than that one can provide. So rather than seeking to avoid that, I might actually look to do a little market research and use that as a starting point. That's not to say that there aren't some totally unmet needs, but I'm going to flip that premise around that's in the question a little bit.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Let's see, we've got a couple other ones. Given the importance of cost point required to really motivate projects at scale, how have the shorter and more volatile oil and gas cycles affected the motivation for energy companies to stick to their net zero and carbon reduction initiatives?
So I'm going to take that if that's okay. I think, originally we noted that a lot of companies were restricting investment in that space, because just lack of discretionary funding, and the targets felt maybe optional or at that point. But I think as time has gone on, at least the super majors are recognizing that we need to move away from that volatility, and how do you create resiliency against that volatility, and moving towards different business models that aren't tied to the oil and gas cycle, can really promote a more sustainable business longer term. Of course, there is a difference between majors and independents. Majors have the resources to kind of diversify across the board. We know that that's happening at BP and Shell. Even Exxon now finally has come up and said that they're going to create a carbon hub here in Houston. But independents, don't have those resources across the board. However, I'd say that there are other opportunities that we are kind of seeing coming up for independents, including a move towards geothermal, or utilizing natural gas utilization for other opportunities. Maybe some small power producers. I don't know if that's actually going to happen, but remains to be seen. So I think while before it, diminished the funding in that direction, we are now seeing business models grow, and we're still in the beginning stages of, what that future looks like. But certainly now, and all the investment and innovation we're seeing in that space, I think is just a testament to oil and gas moving in that direction, and despite that volatility, continuing to invest in that space.
Fantastic, thank you. And Jennifer, I think this is a good question for you actually. How has biodynamic wine affected the regenerative agriculture industry, particularly in Patagonia and Mendoza? He said it's a broad question, but this is one of my colleagues, Alex, and he said he's just still scratching his head about what that all entails. So if you have any insights, that'd be greatly appreciated.
I don't think I have any insights to that, but what I can say to some of the work Patagonia is doing and others, it's really important in the agricultural space to have examples of what others have done that aren't new, but that have been happening for decades over several different types of weather. So the more growers and farms that are trying things out, especially with the support of organizations like the ones that you mentioned and others, all the better it is for learning, failing, learning, trying again, and scaling that up, and giving confidence to others who want to try something out.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question, it says, Jamila touched on a very problematic issue. What do we do with the CO2 once we capture it? Scalability issues aside, CO2 is a very stable molecule, which often requires energy as a part of any reaction to turn it into another product. As an expert in the field, what research avenue or avenues do you see holding the most promise for closing the circular CO2 economy without incurring energy costs that offset the benefit?
That is a very good point, and precisely why the CO2 economy is so difficult for us to overcome. CO2 is very stable, and it requires a ton of energy for us to be able to change that structure into anything else. I think that's one space where renewable energy is very, very important, must be co-located with large-scale renewable power that we can, utilize, whether that's offshore wind or solar or, a number of other opportunities. But I think that point is the primary reason that we are challenged in this space. I think the scalability issues aren't necessarily chemically or technologically holding us back, but it's a cost perspective that drives directly from that energy cost. And large scale renewable power infrastructure projects are very expensive and not often focused on the CO2 economy. They're more focused on consumer use. So that's a very important point, and I think renewable power is kind of the key to answer it.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Let's see, what are your thoughts on carbon markets to drive more financing of climate innovations?
I'll start out talking about that a little, and if anybody else wants to jump in, feel free. That is sort of an ever-present question. I feel like we're waiting for carbon markets to become, especially in the US, where we've had some regional experimentation with that. I think we're at this nascent stage when it comes to putting a formal price on carbon, and the format that takes, I'm a little agnostic on. I would take a broader look on it as well and say, look at places beyond how existing carbon markets are working. I mean, that's part of it, but also to look at where are other ways, what are other mechanisms for pricing in carbon, for beginning to account for it, so that development and use of it can help drive solutions and innovation. And when I think about it from an investor perspective, which is the first way I think about it, I see progress there because corporations themselves are, have been increasingly looking at and setting internal prices on carbon when they do their accounting, and they're asked that by investors. So it's becoming, I think, part of the vernacular a bit more, which I think just sort of spurs the sort of market discussion. I mean, that's what you would hope that well-functioning capital markets would do, is road test some of these concepts, get to some sort of consensus on it, and that can help, I think, spur some broader economic recognition of it. I think policy-wise, even though I'm in Washington, D.C., I tend to spend more time talking about the investor side of it. I don't really know. I don't have a crystal ball on what's going to happen in the next year on that. It's on my list of things to read up on. I know that there are also going to be some mechanisms beyond just having something you can track the way you might hear about stock markets. There are a lot of things going on within the government in terms of putting internal prices on carbon for some of their own internal accounting, and there have been changes there. I know that even before the Biden administration took over, one of the initial things, and this was very buried in the wonky background, was sort of the reference point of what the administration, I can't even remember which agency it was through, but what internal price of carbon they set for types of procurement and investments, which actually drives quite a bit. And I think in the Obama administration, it had been something like $26. And then it went down to something like $8. And they were, I don't know where it has shaken out, but basically it was going to be, it was well expected that it was going to be something like 4 times what it was under the Obama administration. So if you look at some of the signals broadly, I think you see pricing of carbon being done in a way that's more standardized, but we will need to, I think, see that continue to mature a lot more, because it's all still very immature, which is why maybe it's confusing when you start to try to read up on it.
Absolutely. Any more insights on that question, or we can move on to the next?
I just wanted to add that I think the carbon markets are very much tied to the value of CO2. And as we continue to advance innovation to create a market around CO2 utilization, the carbon markets hopefully will become no longer necessary, because people will be eager to save CO2 and capture CO2. However, I do think that those will be closely tied.
I would really echo that in, the space that we play in, where I'm working with Native, I mean, is the carbon market, but also seeing it as that sort of, it's a mechanism needed in this moment until we get it right, with some of the other valuation.
Awesome, thank you. The next question is regarding circularity. What are your thoughts on what is more scalable, biochem based versus engineered?
The only thoughts that I have in the work that I've done from the bio side, generally in the bio work that I've seen, they're very water intensive. Engineered solutions are usually very energy intensive. I haven't seen, big scale bioproducts. We saw the algae boom several years ago, kind of didn't take off for us at that time because of the water requirements, I think was a big part of it. Perhaps on the food side, we'll see more biological opportunities, you know, for example, plant-based protein move forward to kind of address some of our climate goals from the consumer side. However, I think engineered solutions offer a lot more ability to lean on asset infrastructure that we already have. I think that's a big part of it. I'm not sure, you know, when we're talking about circularity from what perspective, but if we're talking about from an energy perspective, for example, transesterification or any kind of algae biodiesel are just generally not easy to achieve. But perhaps we can see some of that more on, you know, coming from natural gas and other sources. So I'd say probably engineered, but I think it's a broad question. And I'm sure all of the other panelists can also address that from their own perspectives, depending on what their sector specialty is.
Yeah, I'm not nearly as technically experienced as Jamila when it comes to this, but I do consider I'm a bit of a science nerd. I always am interested in tracking some of the bio-based developments, and I wouldn't counter that view that the engineered solutions have a bit of an advantage. But I do think that a lot of work is being done, and you never really know what type of breakthrough might come and where it might be useful on the bio side. I know that there is, you know, a lot of work that we have under our belt in terms of using some bio-based solutions, enzymatic solutions, to replace and provide better replacements for other chemical products. So in other sectors, I think the answer ultimately will be, it depends. You know, it's not necessarily an either or. It depends what application you're looking at. And just to sort of reinforce that, I'll note that in this year that we've just had, we're seeing the benefits when it comes to COVID of lots of work on the bio side that led to vaccine development and effectiveness that was, you know, a massive leap from what we had had before. Of course, we hadn't had to have some sort of vaccine deployment. There was a lot of reasons that it was nascent, but there was a lot of work being done in the background. And so I think that that leads me to have some hope that R&D and science developments working on the bio side may yield some good and meaningful advances in places in the future.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That was a great example as well. I appreciate it. And then we have another question. Looking further out, what early stage innovations are you eyeing? For example, blue carbon or space economy? Anything really fun that you're seeing?
From our perspective and the work we're doing, you know, blue carbon is definitely an exciting one. Some great ideas and some things that are great ideas but may not actually make it to scale or work so well. But through our process of assessing new ideas and new solutions, I would say blue carbon is one of the solutions types that we're taking a look at most often, and yeah, are keen to see succeed.
One of the innovations that on our side, on the power side, that we've seen is balancing distributed resources, in particular EVs, you know, residential scale batteries, as well as larger scale batteries, and optimizing those for maximum grid resiliency. Few technologies are already available in the market, but I'm eager to see how those scale and can really create resiliency in the grid on, you know, on a municipal level, and hopefully soon a state and countrywide level as well.
Yeah, I don't know that my work puts me in as good a position to know something very in-depth about anything technical. But I do look for sometimes to find some of the tougher places or the counterintuitive pieces where a simple reframing of something can help mitigate something. I'd read so much about, to take an example, about how cryptocurrency is incredibly climate intensive, right? You can see lots of scary diagrams out there about how it's, dwarfs countries' power usage, and all of that stuff is really true. And yet there are a lot of cryptocurrency is not going to go away just because of this massive power need. In order to do that, there's a usefulness to it beyond some of the silly things you might see in the headline about some digital artwork, fetching huge prices. It's not a passing trend. And I, look beyond that headline, and a story caught my eye about how there was starting to be a move to look at logistics of Bitcoin mining and cryptocurrency mining to be able to place it where there's an oversupply of renewable energy. So, sometimes if you just step back from perhaps the fear-inducing headline and say, well, what is the solution to mitigate this? There's some ways to do that in the approach where you can basically just look at logistics and how to fit the pieces together properly. And some of those pieces, I think it always pays to look at what are the thorniest issues, what are the hardest areas to decarbonize, what are some of the big trends that are troubling, and how can we minimize those or bend that curve.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much. We are nearing the end. So what I'm going to do right now is share my screen so that everyone can see the contact information for our wonderful presenters. So take a screenshot. Sorry, my dog just heard something, so you'll hear her barking. Take a screenshot so that you can actually get to connect with these individuals and ask questions. They are experts in their field. So again, thank you all so much for being here today, and we really appreciate it. Y'all have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Taylor.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Nice to meet you all.